We're continuing on in Jonah, so we're going to finish out our study here. Like I said, there's four central themes if you look at the whole book of Jonah. Those four themes were God's wrath. We talked about that at week 1. And kind of some of chapter 1, that was God correcting the path of Jonah. So Jonah had veered off. He had a calling. He fled, and God kind of corrected his path back onto that. We talked about God's grace, which was him revealing his power to the sailors. Despite Jonah's rebellion, God still saved the sailors from the storm, and that was God's grace being given to the sailors. And then we talked about God's mercy. That was saving Jonah from death and giving him a second chance at his calling. So Jonah jumped into the water. He chose death over repentance, but God saved him from that. He granted him mercy. He saved him from that, and he spent it back on the land. And tonight we're going to talk about God's salvation, and that's the saving message that was to Nineveh. So those four themes are God's wrath, God's grace, God's mercy, and God's salvation. So we're going to finish the last 2 chapters, which are kind of unique because the story doesn't end like most books in the Bible on a high note. It kind of ends on kind of a low note. And it ends with Jonah pretty much pouting. Jonah is mad, upset, he's pouting before God. That's because he didn't get what he wanted. So pretty much like you did as a child, or like you may do now, or like my child does, if they don't get what they want, they start pouting or crying. For some reason, my daughter's really into phones right now. And so when she like sneaks and grabs our phones and we take them from her, she's just like, she starts crying. It's like you just throw something else in her face, but not like at her face. Like you give her something else. But basically, when a child doesn't get what they want, they start pouting, they start moaning, they're crying. That's pretty much what Jonah did. In the original language that this was written in kind of the Hebrew language, is obviously not written in English. This reads more like a comedy. Because the way the language is written, it's softer, it's more humorous. It's written kind of like a comedy. Now, it is a serious story, and it still has a point, but it's written kind of in a comedic style. This story became quite famous, and it was actually frequently read by the Israelites at certain times. A lot of stories in Scripture were read by the Israelites at different times, at different festivals, at different celebrations. They read a lot of different stories in a year, different like celebrations. Like the story of Esther was always around a feast. They read that story, and so Jonah was one of those stories that they read frequently to understand the meaning and to understand what it meant. And so, chapter 4, you can really see, and we'll go through it. His childlike language and behavior is very comedic. In a sense of how you're looking at it. It's kind of like just the I'm mad thing, the way he words it. It was most likely written that way because it was most likely written by Jonah. Now, it doesn't say who the author is, but the very personalization of the book and some of the details in it, you could analyze that it was written by Jonah himself. And so kind of it may have been Jonah looking back on his life, having been faithful to that moment, having been faithful since then, but kind of looking back on that moment of going, wow, why did I ever do that? Kind of looking back, going, man, that was a big learning moment in my life, but also understand his foolish actions and thoughts. And so it was kind of written in a comedic way. Kind of like when you get older, or even now when you look back on certain aspects of your life, you're like, why did I do that? Why was I so mad at that? That was silly to think about. That's kind of how this book can be seen, is that whoever wrote it was looking back going, that was kind of foolish, that was kind of childish in their actions, but it's still something to learn, and we're still going to see that final lesson from Jonah. So, we're going to see that how we look at the world is not how we need to look at how we want it, but rather how God intends it to be. And that's kind of how we wrapped up in Jonah. Jonah had a certain idea of what he wanted, but that was not what God intended. So we can't live life as a believer and think it's all the way that we want. You are not going to always get what you want. Now, in some aspects, yes, you will get what you want. But we can't have a mindset of going, I'm always going to get what I want and live my life, especially as a believer, always thinking, I want this. That's a dangerous way to live as a believer. Rather, we need to see what God has intended for us in our lives. And so tonight, we're going to look at what Jonah wanted and how God had to change Jonah's mind to see the world as God intended it to be, and how he intended those actions to come out. So, Jonah only wanted to see the world how he perceived, but God needed Jonah and us, similarly, to see the world from his perspective and his intention for calling us in that. So, number 1, we're going to look at what Jonah wanted. And Jonah wanted, number 1, God's mercy to be limited. Jonah wanted God's mercy to be limited. So this is Jonah's perspective on the world. We're going to learn from Jonah's perspective, and then we're going to see how God's perspective is better, and how we need to see God's perspective over our own and equate ourselves to Jonah. So Jonah wanted God's mercy to be limited. And you can see this in chapter 4, verse 2. This is Jonah praying. And he prayed to the Lord and said, O Lord, is not this what I said when I was yet in my country? This is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and relenting from disaster. So now, Jonah finally reveals why he ran away. So he's like, you called me, I ran because of this, because I knew you were going to be merciful to them. So Jonah admits that he fled because he wanted Nineveh to be destroyed. That's what he wanted. They were an enemy of Israel for so many years. They bullied them and all that stuff, and he wanted them to be destroyed. So Jonah felt that God's mercy should only be for him and for Israel. He felt others didn't deserve the same mercy that was extended to him and to his whole country. That steadfast love that we talked about last week, that covenant love that God promised to Abraham and the people, they wanted to be selfish of that. They wanted that to be only for themselves. But they saw that being extended to others, and Jonah knew that was going to be extended to Nineveh, and he didn't want that. That's why he ran. He knew that's what God was going to do, so that's why he ran. That covenant love, he only wanted it for themselves. So this happens again later in the New Testament, because the Jews wanted salvation to be only for them and not for the Gentiles. It actually became a big argument between Paul and Peter, because Peter saw it only for the Jews until he had a dream. God literally had to show him in a vision, hey, this is for the Gentiles too. So even in the New Testament, mirrored to the Old Testament, is going, salvation comes. Now this is after Jesus has ascended. The disciples are going out and they're only preaching to the Jews because they think the Jews are God's chosen people and salvation is only for the Jews. And so Paul comes along and goes, no, it's for the Gentiles also, it's for everyone. And so now it's not just for them. And this is the same thing happened with Jonah. Jonah thought it was just for them, but no, it's for everyone. So sometimes we have that same outlook on the world. Well, if they do this, or we think, oh, if they do that, they don't deserve God. Right? But the question is, how are we any better? A sinner is a sinner. If you were shown mercy, why not have that for others? And I sometimes feel this way. I feel this way now more than I ever have. Because I look at certain aspects of the world, I look at certain aspects of culture, and I see people make statements, and I see people make decisions, and you're like, man, like there's some people who just make some outright crazy, like statements about God and religion. And sometimes I sit back and just go, just wait. And that's a terrible way to think. But it gets in my mind sometimes because I'm like, I feel like nothing on earth is going to get through to them. I had a student this way. I had a student who I mentored for years in his small group. I mean, all the time, with these guys all the time. And this is one who, his dad kind of ran out on him, and his mom was Jewish, but he just refused. He refused, and I say refused because he knew the truth. He just refused to accept Jesus Christ and God and all that. And he wanted a supernatural sign. And everyone would keep telling him, like, dude, the signs are all around you. The signs are all around us. But I got to the point that I never gave up on him. He eventually graduated, and then I moved down here. But I got to the point, I'm like, man, I think is this going to take him seriously standing before God one day? And then, like, you know, and I'm very imaginative, and I get these pictures in my mind of, like, you know, like, I stand before God, and then I go past, and he's like, well done, thou good faithful servant, right? And I pass, but then, like, what if I, like, pass someone in line, like that student, and he's like, dude, why didn't you tell me? Like, I told you countless times. But I get these thoughts in my mind, like, man, I feel like only God himself, like, verbally speaking to these people are going to make them understand. But sometimes it's like, man, I just want you to stand before God on Judgment Day. And that's a terrible way to think, but that's what Jonah was doing. Jonah was going, no, they don't deserve any mercy beyond what we get. We're the only ones that should get mercy. And so we can't look at the world like that. In other words, you need to have an understanding of, listen, you are in the same boat. Just because you didn't do as bad of stuff as them, you still sin before a holy God, And that puts you all in the same category. It didn't matter if you were the worst criminal ever. It didn't matter if you were Hitler. You were born into sin and you were the same as him before God's eyes. You were unholy before him. And so if all of us are in that same boat, and you've been granted mercy through Jesus Christ, why would you not look to extend that to others? And that's how we need to see the world. And Jonah refused to do that. But God's mercy, number two, God's mercy has no limits. God's mercy has no limits. God's mercy has no limits. Chapter 3, verse 10 says this. When God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil way, God relented of the disaster that he had said he would do to them, and he did not do it. God relented of that disaster. God relented. So Jonah wanted destruction, and God intended salvation. Because that's how Jonah was like. He's like, no mercy for none of them. I want them to have destruction. God's like, no, I'm having mercy on them. And so we as believers, we can't operate with the mindset that we are more deserving of mercy than anyone else in the world. We must look out in the world with God's love and remember that that same love is what we were shown, and that's the same love that we need to show others. We were as lost as them, and we were shown mercy. Mercy doesn't serve our interests. Mercy doesn't serve our interests. In other words, you can't say, well, I want mercy and justice for them. Mercy doesn't serve your interests. God granted you mercy, and mercy just can't be for us and you want justice for others, and that's sometimes how we look at the world. That's a very dangerous thing to do. God's mercy has no limits. And you've been shown that mercy, so we need to show others that mercy. We are called to go and tell others of what God has done. All right, number three. Jonah wanted God's grace for the thankful. Jonah wanted God's grace for the thankful. Jonah wanted God's grace for the thankful. Verses 5 and 6 of chapter 4 say this. So this is afterwards, this is the very last chapter. So Jonah went out of the city of Nineveh. This is after he preached and they got saved. Jonah went out of the city and sat to the east of the city and made a booth for himself there. He sat under it in the shade till he should see, that's hard to say, what would become of the city. So in other words, he left the city, goes and sits on the outskirts of the city, looking down the city and goes, well, maybe they're still getting destroyed. So he's still looking for it. So he's seeing what's going to happen. Now the Lord God appointed a plant and made it come up over Jonah, that it might be a shade over his head to save him from his discomfort. So Jonah was exceedingly glad because of the plant. So Jonah goes outside the city, he's sitting on a hill or whatnot, and he's overlooking the city, hoping it'll still be destroyed. This is in the Middle East, the sun is beating down on him, he has very little shade. So God has this plant grow overnight with these giant leaves, and it gives him shade. And Jonah's thankful for that. So Jonah was thankful for God's grace. Jonah knew God's grace and had experienced it many times before. Even before this story, Jonah had experienced God's grace because he was of the people of Israel. He understood that. He knew God was the creator, and in this case, he controlled that plant that came over him, so he was thankful for that. So Jonah was thankful because he recognized and acknowledged God's grace. He felt grace should be reserved. He felt grace should be reserved for those who understand and acknowledge it. And that was his problem. Because those who experienced God's grace but weren't thankful should no longer receive it, is what his mindset was. He goes, I understand God's grace because I understand who God is. So I knew he grew this plant over me, and I'm thankful for that. But if you don't know God, then you shouldn't get God's grace because you don't know how to acknowledge God for it. That was his mindset. And we can sometimes have that similar mindset. Right? You people have no idea what God did for you. And some people preach that way, and I don't necessarily agree with that, because if they don't understand God's love, if you don't understand God, then you don't know love, because God is love. And so you want to force it upon them, but first you miss a step of, they don't know who God is. So how can they see what God did for them if they don't know God's love, and they don't know God's love if they know God himself? And so we will look at them and go, how dare you, God did this, God did that. Listen, they don't understand it, they don't get that. We have to see the world turn from God, and they blaspheme his name. We see all this. You can look out in culture. It's becoming very prevalent in American society, especially on social media. They want to blaspheme God. They want to turn down God. They want to do all this stuff. So we see them reject the truth, and then they lift up culture and the world. But here's the thing. God's grace is extended to all. God's grace is extended to all. So Jonah just wanted God's grace for the thankful. He didn't want grace for those who don't understand and aren't thankful for it. But God's grace is extended to all. 10 and 11 say this in chapter 4. So, he has the plant, and then God brings up a worm, and it kills the plant. So now Jonah is mad and angry. And so God says this, and the Lord said, you pity the plant for which you do not labor, nor do you make it grow, which came into being in a night and perished in a night. And should I not pity Nineveh, the great city, in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle. So God's like, listen, you didn't make the plant grow, but yet you weren't even mad at it. Jonah actually said this. So God appointed a worm. When the sun rose, God appointed a scorching east wind, and the sun beat down on Jonah's head. This is before these verses. Jonah said, and he was faint, and he asked that he might die. This is Jonah, asked that he might die. And Jonah said, is it better for me to die than to live? But God said to Jonah, do you do well to be angry for the plant? And Jonah says, yes, I do well to be angry enough to die. Right? Very childish. I'm angry enough to die. Some of you are kind of dramatic in that, how you talk. Some of you are like, I almost died. You got to be the bottom of the ski lift, like you saw a mini avalanche of snow. God, I almost died. You didn't. You're perfectly fine. I didn't say it. But all of you do it. It's a whole, I almost died. That's how every story starts. I almost died. What happened? A squirrel attacked. You're fine. Alright, but, so that's how you can see that. This is Jonah going, oh, yes, I'm angry enough to die. And so this is when God says this. Listen, God says, and the Lord says, you pity the plant for which you do not labor. That's what makes a statement of going, listen, it doesn't matter what you think, it doesn't matter your anger. Here's the thing, is like before, this is what he's telling Jonah, before you were thankful for the plant that I grew over you and you were thankful for it. But when I took it away, you got mad at me. You got mad at me. So he's making this equation. He's like, listen, I created Nineveh. I created all the people in that. There's 120,000 souls of my precious children that I created in that place. So what gives you the right, Jonah, to think I'm not going to extend them grace? I gave you the plant and took it away. I gave these people, so I have the right to take them away or to keep them if I want to. And that's what he's saying. It's like God's grace is extended to all. God so loved the world. God so loved the world. So just because people refuse to acknowledge that God exists or God, what God does for them, doesn't mean He loves them any less. Someone may reject God. That doesn't change His love for them. God so loved the world. His grace is extended to all. We are no special people, right? We don't have a monopoly on God's grace. We don't. It's not for us to control, thank goodness. Because God is the creator. He holds the power over creation. It will stand or fall as He sees fit. He created it all. So He's like, I'm not going to destroy these 120,000 people if I can show them grace and mercy. And so this is the problem that Jonah has with grace. Right? This is the difference between grace and mercy. So mercy is not getting what you deserve. So if you deserve death and you're not granted death, that's mercy. So mercy is not getting what you deserve. So mercy comes to those who are miserable or in a great need. So if someone commits a severe crime and they deserve a severe punishment, but they're not given that punishment, that's mercy. They were in a place of great need. They were in a place of misery because they'd done something wrong that deserved a severe punishment to it, and they did not get it, so that's mercy. Grace is getting what you don't deserve. So grace is getting what you don't deserve. So if you didn't deserve something and it still came to you, that's grace. So grace also comes to those who are miserable and are also in great need. So at times, yeah, you may be miserable. You may be a time where you need grace and it's given to you. But here's the other side of grace. Grace also comes to those who have no particular need. And so this is where Jonah got mad. Because, yeah, we can, at even times ourselves, we can grant people mercy. If something was to happen to you in some type of situation, you'll see in news stories all the time about, people are murdered and their family forgives them for something like that. That's mercy. You can show people mercy even in little ways, like if somebody does something to you and you don't retaliate in a way. That's showing mercy. They deserve that, but you don't give it to them. So you can show mercy, you can. And sometimes believers are pretty good at that. Where believers fail is showing grace. Right? Because we can see when people are in extreme misery. We can see when people are in great need. We're like, oh, I have mercy on you for that. But when people have no particular need at all, we are not very good at just extending them grace. Not because they deserve it in any way. Remember, grace is getting what you don't deserve. Just because we love them. And that's been given to you through Jesus Christ. God's like, listen, Jonah, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what I do for Nineveh. It's me showing grace. Even if they didn't need me, I'm going to show them grace. There are times where we don't need God, but God still shows us grace. He still has things happen in our lives. We need to understand that. But that was Jonah's problem with that. But both these come with no merit of our own. But we need to be much better, especially as believers, at showing grace. In other words, look for those who aren't even in need and showing them grace, giving them something they don't deserve. Picking them up in some way. Motivating them. Being loving to them. These are things that we need to do as believers and be gracious. This is what Jonah was jealous for. He didn't see the need for some to have grace. But God doesn't need a reason to show grace because grace is extended to all. Number 5. Almost done. Number 5. Jonah wanted God's salvation for the church. Israel. You don't have to put Israel. You just put church. Jonah wanted salvation. Jonah wanted God's salvation for the church. Number 5. Jonah wanted God's salvation for the church. I'll put Israel there next time. Jonah wanted God's salvation for the church. 4:1 says this. But this displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry. And God says later in verse 4, he says, do you do well to be angry? Like he keeps poking at Jonah. Like, do you do well to be angry, Jonah? Do you like being angry? Do you like being angry at plants? But he says this. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry. What displeased Jonah? That God was merciful, that God saved Nineveh. Listen, that God saved Nineveh displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry. Jonah was angry at salvation. What a place to be. That Jonah was angry at salvation. Jonah had such a small outlook on the world that he thought salvation was just for Israel. Just for God's people. He thought the rest of the world was to be destroyed because Israel was constantly being attacked. They were constantly being destroyed. They were persecuted for their beliefs. They were always on attack by others around them. So Jonah concluded that only Jews deserve God and everyone else should die. That was Jonah's mindset on that. But here's the scary part. Is today, we're not far off. And that's where I'm talking about the church. Sometimes we just want God's salvation for the church. Because we have a tendency to close the church and only invite to those we feel deserve. We do. The American church has this problem is we want to make this box and close the doors and be like, oh, we only want this certain group inside. We only want Republicans. We only want the rich people. We only want white people. We only want those who are dressed properly. We only want those who are clean cut. We only want those who have a job. Oh, they're deserving of God's salvation. Oh, what a dangerous, dangerous place to be. But that's where I feel we've gotten as the American church going, oh, you need to fit the stipulations before we tell you about Jesus. Everyone. That's being angry at salvation. That's a dangerous, dangerous place for our church to be. I'm not talking about just our church. I'm talking about the American church of going, hey, you need to fit this stipulation before I talk to you. Oh, you look like someone that I won't make confrontation with, so I'll tell you about Jesus. And look at another and go, no, I know about them. They don't deserve it. They don't need. They're not going to believe it anyway. So I'm not saying. That's a very dangerous place to be. Salvation is not limited to a socio-economic standard or to any standard of man. Number 6, God's salvation is for the lost. God's salvation is for the lost. God's salvation is for the lost. The rest of chapter 3 says this in verse 4. Jonah began to go into the city, going a day's journey, and he called out, yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. And the people of Nineveh believed God. They called for a fast and put on sackcloth, from the greatest of them to the least of them. The word reached the king of Nineveh, and he arose from his throne, removed his robe, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat in ashes. And he issued a proclamation and published through Nineveh, by the decree of the king and his nobles, let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock, taste anything, let them not feed or drink water, but let man and beast cover with sackcloth, this is the thing for mourning, and let them call out mightily to God. Let everyone turn from his evil way and from the violence that is in his hand. Who knows, he says himself, God may relent and turn from this fierce anger so that we may not perish. We read verse 10. When God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil way, God relented the disaster that he had for them, and he did not do it. So God's intention was to save them. He simply needed Jonah to speak the message. Jonah was never meant to be selective of who was going to hear the message, nor was he meant to do the saving itself. He simply wanted him to carry the message. And you are called to do the same thing. You are called to simply carry that message. Right? It doesn't matter who we think is best. It doesn't matter who we may select, right, or be easiest to talk to, or not choose the moments in which we think are not going to represent Christ. Listen, you are called to go and tell with your lives, with everything in your lives. We can't look back at the world as Jonah did and only see what we want to see. And that's a dangerous, dangerous place to be. We can't look out the world and going, you know what, he looks like he deserves Christ, or he doesn't deserve Christ, or he'll never. No. No. God's mercy is for everyone. God's grace is extended to all. God's salvation is for the lost. We must be faithful to serve God and see the world with what he intended for everyone to hear, which is the gospel. The gospel of Jesus Christ. That's what he intended for you. His mercy, his grace, his salvation is not limited to how we see it. We must tell everyone and let the Lord work in their lives. We never know who might repent, but we should live our lives knowing all deserve to hear the grace, mercy, and salvation that we ourselves receive. Listen, just to wrap up, is this talking about Jonah had one perspective on the world, and it was his limited perspective of what he wanted. Because he was blinded by certain things, so he only saw what he wanted to see. If you put blinders on and only see what you want to see, and only think God's going to serve you in this certain area, or only think God can do this much, you're going to miss out on a lot of what he's intended for you and for your life. Now, can you have a good, decent life? Yes. Yes, you can. But it's a very, very dangerous place to be. We talked about before, it's complacency. It's being complacent. It's just going, you know what? I'm just going to sit here in cruise control. Oh, I got so mad the other day. It was a college student that I know really well, and I talked to him about, I was like, hey, you know, would you ever plan on coming back here? And I said, if you did come back here to Hartwell, would you come to First Baptist? And he's like, yeah. I was like, well, why? He's like, because it's comfortable. I wanted to stop him across the table. I was like, I don't spend all this time with you for you just to be comfortable. Students, listen. The Christian life is not made to be comfortable. It's not made to be comfortable. Will you be happy? Yes. Will you have joy? Yes. Because you are serving Christ Almighty. But it is not made to be comfortable. Why? Because we have an uncomfortable thing to do. We are representatives of God. on this world, and we talked about this before. Listen, the world hates you because they hated Christ first. And so that's why it's not comfortable. Why? Because this is not your home. This is not your home. So you shouldn't be comfortable here. And so for you to settle in and go, no, it's comforting. No. No. If it's comforting, move. You need to keep moving for God. God has huge things for you. He will carry you through this life. Like I said, it will be rewarding. But you still have to open your mind and understand what God has intended and not narrow your focus to what you think is the best way for what you want. Because that's what Jonah did. And he looks back on this confidently going, man, God had such big things for me. If only I would have seen them from the beginning. If only I would have took, however long it took me to run away, God do all these things just for me to come back and do exactly what He wanted me to first do. Because God's intended way is going to happen. It's a matter of us listening and understanding and focusing on God going, man, He has great things for me, and I don't want to get comfortable, but I want to do everything for Him. You can still serve Him in so many different aspects. But just serve Him. Open your eyes to see what God has for the world. His grace, His mercy, His salvation is for everyone, and you are carrying that message. Please, please, don't not give someone that message because you think they don't deserve it, or it's not what you want. We've got to open our eyes and see the world and see the mercy that's been given to us and give it to them.